I'm going to dive right in and people will join when they join. So, welcome back, everyone, to the next mastermind call with Every Move Collective. We really appreciate you being here to learn about ADUs, housing reform, the YouTube effect with our guest, Ryan O'Connell. So, before I go ahead and introduce Ryan, I just want to remind some of you who may or may not know who we are. Myself, my mom, my brother, Eva, and Dylan, who are on this call, run a top producing team out of Westchester County, New York, and Connecticut. We also run the organization Every Move Collective at EXP, which brings you these bi-monthly masterminds. We foster learning, networking, community. These happen on the second and fourth Monday of every month. Always a different topic, different guest speaker. So we're really glad that you're here with us for this speaker and this topic today. We encourage you to be as conversational as possible. Use the chat, raise your hand, jump in, ask questions, and if you can turn your cameras on, it would mean a lot to us, and I think Ryan, so that we could see the room that we are with. But so without further ado, we've got Ryan O'Connell here with us. Hi, Ryan.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Ryan is on a mission to reduce the housing shortage. He helps owners build houses in their backyards with accessory dwelling units, which are ADUs. Some people maybe know them as in-law suites, but the term being used now, ADUs, and he also works on pro-housing legislation. He's built a really big following on TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube, and teaches exactly on this topic with a channel called How to ADU. So he's got tons to share with us today, and we're really excited to hear from him. So, yeah, I know my mom's going to kind of facilitate a little bit of back and forth conversation with you, Ryan. So I'll hand her over the mic.
Hey, Ryan, thanks so much for joining in here. And before we even ask any questions, I would love for you to kind of say hello, give a little bit of a summary of what you're looking to accomplish today. Before we actually do that, just a little surprise. I'd like to wish Colby a happy birthday. Her birthday was yesterday. So she's I'm not gonna say, I won't say how old because then I'd have to tell you how old I am. Anyway, Ryan, tell us a little bit about, what you'd like to accomplish on this call today.
I came in to wish Colby a happy birthday. Happy birthday, Colby. I think, like Colby said, I'm really trying to reduce the housing shortage, but one person can't do that. Even a lot of people can't do that. So what I try to do is equip other people with the information they need to go out and if you're interested in this, whether it's because it helps your real estate business or because you're curious about this and passionate about it, I just want to give people the information they need to go out and be more effective. And because I did a lot of that on YouTube and TikTok and stuff, if you guys are at any point, you're like, this is getting too wonky. Ryan's, please explain these acronyms to me. Please explain what you're talking about. Or let's move on to the YouTube stuff. I just want to give people the information that goes and makes them more powerful because you're going to go on and do God's work while I'm sitting back here with a bunch of books about housing.
Well, that said, maybe you could just start off by saying, how did you actually start to go down this path?
Yeah, so I was an employer. Like I helped start a business called Naked Wines in Napa, California, which is where I'm broadcasting from today. And Naked did well. It was always a funny sentence. I have to say, Naked Wines did well. Otherwise, people start worrying about my second line of work. And we were hiring all the time, but it was hard to hold on to our best people, especially locals. And I started to realize that there was a real housing shortage, which was driving my best people farther and farther out. And it was affecting not just my area, but all of California. And then I kind of started doing the research and was like, oh my God, this is a nationwide issue. We've got housing in all the wrong places. So that's kind of how I fell in. It's just like a, a business person who was like, this is weird. What we know how to build houses. Like, why aren't we just doing the thing we need? And kind of fell in that way. Um, since then, I just got really interested as an advocate and volunteer. And when California did something really unique, it looked at the success in places like Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver in Canada, and it said, "Hey, we could do this at the state level, make it legal for homeowners to build in their backyards or to convert part of the house into a little apartment. And if we did that one change and use this little esoteric term, accessory dwelling unit, we could really, this might be something. And that's where I hopped in, and I've been riding this wave on the shoulders of giants, and it's been, the mixed metaphors has been really fun.
Wait,
Excellent.
Ryan, I've been to your
Yeah.
place at winery.
Oh my gosh, Karen, you've been to O Vineyards or Naked Wines?
I went to the one right up in North Bend, Oregon.
Okay, so technically, and you're absolutely right. That one's called Naked Winery, so it sounds super similar. With that, it's a slightly different business, and we do play well with them these days.
Okay.
But
I'm sorry.
I
was a little
love their
excited
wines
for a
too.
minute.
Oh well, I mean, I'm still excited. It means you're out there tasting good wines up in Bend and Oregon.
So,
Thanks.
Ryan, can you elaborate a little bit on the current state of the housing shortage and how
Yeah.
ADUs are playing a role in alleviating it? And as you know, we mentioned earlier, I'm in New York. How it varies state to state. Are there certain areas that are leading the way, or whatever?
So the shortage is pretty uniform countrywide. It's that, populations move around based on where jobs are and where opportunities are, but housing is slow. And we built a ton in the 50s and 60s. The government pretty much subsidized it with mortgage reform and a lot of investment. And then we kind of stopped building that style of housing in the 70s. And we went to either very large single family homes, like 2,500 square feet plus, or large apartment buildings. And the middle, like I'm currently sitting in a 1952 single family home that was built in Napa. It's 1,200 square feet, which is a lot of house for my wife and I. But that's not getting built anymore. And so the amount of inventory in that size is dwindling. In the meantime, our families have shrunk in this country. We have a lot more split couples. We have a lot more smaller families. We have young adults who are delaying having children. And so you end up having people who want smaller and smaller homes, but the houses we build are either gigantic or apartments. And so there's a real disparity. And then it got even worse in '08 because even the big ones we stopped building, and there was another little crap. So if you look at any graph, anywhere where people actually want to live because there's economic opportunity, the rents have gone up and to the right. And so this is a problem everywhere. Now, the solution varies place to place. And so California, lot of yards because we did most of the development in the 50s and 60s. And so there's like a lot of backyard space to be building in. Even in denser areas like Berkeley or Oakland or there's a lot of conversion possibilities. In places in metro areas like New York, Philadelphia, their ADUs aren't always the best solution, right? There's certain neighborhood styles where maybe they make a difference, but you're never going to see the numbers that you're seeing in a state like California, where now 1 in 5 new units in California is an ADU as of last year, which is crazy, right? It's a big old state. That's
Wow.
tens and tens of thousands of accessory dwelling units. But whatever it is, if it's townhouses, if it's little bump outs, whatever the solution is for your region, politicians are going to start creating avenues for your homeowners to be doing that stuff. And what's really interesting is the American Enterprise Institute and other think tanks have looked at this, and the type of people who develop these little onesie twosies, they are not Lennar, right? Like nobody's changing their business model to do little 1-2 units. And the quick flippers aren't really the people who love doing that either, because it's like going to take 9-12 months a lot of the time to get permits and construction. So it's really a new category of home buyer and home developer that's emerging for this missing middle housing that we talk about a lot. So yeah, the solution varies a little bit everywhere, but wherever you are, there is a solution.
So this may be a kind of silly question, but if you build something like that in your backyard and you have the ability to do that, when you sell it, do you sell the homes together or do you sell them separately?
That's not a silly question. That's you're on your fingers on the pulse. So in California, the first raft of laws we passed said, hey, this is an accessory to the primary house. Means you can't sell just the accessory. They got to go together. And in some states where they adopt regulation, they say actually there's an owner occupancy requirement. So when you get the permit for the ADU, you got to sign a deed restriction that says this isn't an investment property where you're renting both units. You have to live in one or both of the units. So that's kind of how things start. But this year, California passed a law that says actually, if a city wants to, it can allow the separate sale and conveyance of an accessory dwelling unit through a condominium map. So in places like San Jose has just adopted this rule, which is a very large city, right? And then places like Austin have been doing it for a long time in Texas. Seattle's been doing it for a while. So there are mature markets where people condominiumize the ADU and sell it separately, and condominiumize the main house and sell it separately. So there's lots of ways to set up these mini HOAs once it becomes legally viable in your area. There are attorneys who specialize in that in each area, and it's a great way. You can imagine realtors' eyes tend to light up because now I'm getting somebody in on a property, and then I'm helping them condominiumize, and now they've got like 2, 3, sometimes 4 units depending on how the cities set up the rules.
Very interesting. I'm not sure if anybody has any questions, but please feel free to pop in here anytime, either through the chat or just asking. But I will say with that note, until anybody, does pop in, I'll ask, what steps should real estate agents take to kind of stay ahead of, the housing reform and leveraging ADUs and different business strategies? Like what is the avenue to learn more, in the best avenue, in your opinion?
So there's an ADU Academy that I highly recommend. If you want to tell people, like, I know the basics, I've got a certification, it can count towards your continuing education credits in certain markets. You can go, and there's about to be one in Seattle, and then there'll be another one either in San Diego or LA. That's actually where I met Colby, was at the after for one of those events. And that academy is top notch. I'm a communications partner in full transparency, but like I was an attendee before any of that. That will give you the certification and the basics, and you'll be probably the first person in your county or perhaps your state, depending on where you're from, to be able to say that. Once you've got that, to keep up, I'm very self-serving, and I say, hey, I have a YouTube channel and an Instagram and all that jazz, so you can follow along. I just popped a link in the chat to an example of a video where I go to Austin, I show a condominium ADU, and I kind of talk to the builder and the lawyer who did it. And that's a good example where people in California, the ADU condos are still new. So you go to where they exist and you cover it, and you just share, the basic facts and figures. And that's a great way to keep up with stuff.
Was somebody popping in for a question?
Yeah,
or
please pop up.
I did see something here in the chat, ADU certification. What website do you go to for that?
Yeah, I'll pull up the link while you guys are asking me the next question. And
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I just, as you were chatting, and I had mentioned to you before we got on the call that in New York, this is something relatively foreign to me. And I would think that's probably true for a lot of agents in this area. So if you're from New York and you want to, get ahead of the curve, you can have somebody on your team get ADU certified, and you can offer something that other people aren't. But besides getting certified, maybe you could hit on a couple of things that, or key benefits that, might either benefit the homeowner, or, maybe some of the challenges that a homeowner might face when considering an ADU option.
Yeah. So once the rules allow for it, then you've got a bunch of other problems that crop up. Financing can be pretty complicated. Fannie and Freddie are starting to adopt better rules because of the impact of the Californian reform. And that once that trickles through, you're going to start seeing products that acknowledge ADUs more explicitly, but it can still be a little complicated. The definitions vary state to state, and so a lot of the research that you'll do, you'll find one definition of ADU, and then, like, for example, we'll go Fannie and Freddie. It's it's one ADU per property. But then you go states like Arizona and Colorado, which just adopted new legislation about ADUs, they skip straight ahead to 2 ADUs per property. So their state definition is already ahead of Fannie and Freddie again. And you'll run into a lot of contradicting information or misinformation. And it's just important to be humble and say, this is an ever-changing landscape. The way I serve my clients is I get them in touch with the city planners. And like I put them in touch with the resources they need to be at the head of the curve, not to hear what I learned 2 years ago. That's kind of the two biggest things: finance, and then the variations from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I'll also say just it takes the wind out of my sails, but sometimes ADU is not the best solution. So if you're in a city that doesn't have any ADU rules yet, or sometimes even if you do, sometimes I talk to people about their goals and they're talking about short-term vacation rental. An ADU requires a full kitchen. It's a permanent habitation. It's a very expensive project in most markets. If you're doing a short-term rental, maybe what you want to do is put in a little kitchenette, little microwave kind of thing, and you don't want an ADU permit. You want a detached guest room or whatever the language needs to be in that area, and you want to avoid the phrase ADU as much as humanly possible, so that you keep a lighter, faster, cheaper permitting process. So it just varies. It varies.
I was actually going to ask sort of what the difference is between like an in-law suite and an ADU, because I think like when I first talked to my mom about bringing this topic to this call, she was unfamiliar with the term ADU, but more familiar with the term in-law suite.
Yeah.
And there's definitely
and there's
sounds like from what you just described.
Well, there's tons of overlap, right? And like I said, even ADU, we can't all agree on the definition. So it just depends. And it's always down to your local planning department, because even if this reform happens at the state level, even when sometimes it happens at the national level, you still have somebody in your local city agency that's going to give you the permit or not. They're the ones who make your life happy or make your life very difficult. And so it pays to have both audiences in mind. In a state like California, yeah, so ADUs have to be permanent habitable. And there's actually the state gives cities the right to forbid short-term rental under 30 days on an ADU. Some cities, like Los Angeles, largely choose to not enforce this. I have not heard of an enforcement case out of the tens of thousands of units in LA. Mm-hmm. Other cities are very strict about it. I live in Napa. Napa doesn't allow short-term rentals at all. A lot of the economy is funded by hotel occupancy tax. So not only are ADUs enforced against, but like they keep an eye on all the listings and they report and fine when they see things pop up. So you got everything across the market. Other big differences, it's really the kitchen. I'd say like out of all of the different things that come up, having a full kitchen and a full bathroom tend to make the big difference that make people choose one direction or another. The other piece, I guess, that's worth mentioning is people talk about tiny homes, and they quickly mean tiny homes on wheels sometimes. So if something is not up to residential building code, and you're housing people in that's a different bucket. And different regions have different solutions. It is also a cool option to explore, but it's kind of a very different thing if things are motorized or if they're on wheels and built to ANSI code. Those are like a whole different kettle of fish. We're mostly talking about ADUs, which are just houses, and they just have a separate permitting designation that allows us to build them in single family zones.
Yeah, that actually just kind of touched on one of the questions we got in the chat, which is ADU the same as a mobile home? And do we need to title it?
So great, different, slightly different too, different overlap. So we call this manufactured housing now, right? That's what we used to call mobile homes. Manufactured housing can be used to build ADUs in most places that allow ADUs. State of California, for example, has explicitly said the city can't prevent you from using manufactured housing. Then that said, you can have mobile homes that aren't ADUs, that are primary units, right? Also, I would encourage people to think about structures can have multiple units in them, right? And what we think of as townhouses, those that in some senses, those are one structure, right, with multiple units in them. And that word duplex, triplex, all these words have a little bit of wiggle in them. So try to learn the language of the local planners so that you can navigate and speak to them in their own lingo. Um, I just saw something really exciting in DC actually at the Innovative Housing Showcase that the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, puts on each year now. They had approved last year, they had seen a HUD code duplex. So this is a manufactured housing unit, one section, like the size of a shipping container that goes on the back of a truck. And it was plans for having a 2 unit in one section, which has never been legal before. And as of this month, they're supposed to update the code to allow for it. And we got to see the unit that would produce. That is basically the same cost as a one section, 1 unit. You're just adding a little bit of kitchen finishes and bathroom finishes, but it is now a duplex in one section. And so it's going to do really remarkable things for people who do want to invest in manufactured housing development, usually in rural areas with more space in the yard. And yeah, it's super interesting. You see a little bit of everything developing everywhere all at once.
So just to elaborate on that a little bit, because I don't know, in my New York single family home mind, I'm picturing, my house on the property and then a separate unit that doesn't move from what you're saying here, right? And that's the unit that we're talking about, as opposed to a mother-in-law suite or situation is always part of the house, right? So we're talking about definitely two separate homes, and wouldn't be uncommon to have one bigger and then one smaller on the same property.
And that's one classic mode, like how they tend to be shaped. Another one is literally the bump out, where you do an attachment on the existing house. Another one is a conversion, where, like in LA, they're mostly garage conversions. So people take the garage that faces the back alley, turn it into a house, a 400 square foot home. And so you can have any version of these, whether it's a conversion, a detached structure, or a bump out, or a conversion of a detached structure. So,
and could
for example,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, for example, in
think of something,
California,
because could somebody just
yeah,
buy land and not have a property on it at all and just make it
so the
that?
superpower of the A in ADU is it's an accessory, and
Okay.
it piggybacks off of all of the infrastructure for the primary home. So in California, if you buy a piece of land with a home on it, a dwelling, whether that is commercially zoned, residentially zoned, or whatever, it has an existing primary home, you can build an accessory dwelling now. If you buy virgin land or land with only commercial structures on it or whatever, a lot of cities will say, first you got to build the primary, and then we'll let you build the accessory, or you can do them simultaneously, but you really need to do the processes involved in like bringing utility hookups and other things for your primary in order to benefit for the ADU, which is different than laws like SC9 in California or other legislation that passes. Minneapolis has recently upgraded single family zoning to allow for multiple units on every single property. So those are slightly different versions of that.
I am curious how many people on the call are actually familiar with. I know we have people from all over, right, Cole?
Yeah, it's a pretty diverse group state-wise anyway.
I see a
And
Golden Gate Bridge, so at least one person must know a lot about this stuff.
so I'm just curious, is this something people here are familiar with, or is it brand spanking new for you? Because for me, as I mentioned, it's a pretty novel thing for me. Anybody want to jump in? Oh, everybody's on mute, so if you want to unmute, jump in.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm in Long Beach, California, and
no one knows.
I did get my certification ADUs from the California Association of Realtors. They had a, one class that we took that, basically gave us a certification, but I'm looking for something a little deeper. And I noticed that a lot of agents, they don't know how to approach the sales part about this. And I see things that are, properties that are, front house and then an ADU, one or two in the back. And they don't know how to, differentiate it among, like other income properties. And so, there seems to be a lack of understanding about cash flow and things like that. That's what I see a lot of. And then, because I have clients that are starting to build these things and I want to sell them, of course. So I'm looking for ways that I can sell them more effectively, because I see a lot of these ADUs, they're lagging on the market because I think people just don't understand how to sell them the right way.
You're nailing it. There's a huge and wonderful lag effect for certain kinds of investors before the ADUs get priced in properly. And you said exactly why. Some people are viewing these as commercial properties, but with not enough units until you get to like 3+ or hopefully 5. Then the math starts mathing, and then a lot other people are just like, so it's more square footage, but is it equitable to the square footage of the main house? Like, what am I doing here? And appraisers actually have a really hard time because they see how diverse ADUs are and they don't love pulling comps. One ADU can be very different from another ADU to the point Ava was making it clear. So huge problem in your specific area, Kelly. There's a guy named Sidney Loiseau who's an appraiser that specializes in ADUs and makes it his business, and like definitely worth connecting.
Sure.
There's kind of an appraiser like that in every region that starts getting a lot of ADUs because somebody realizes there's a huge opportunity to do some slightly more rigorous uh, cross geography comps and using slightly more in-depth methodology to show like what the rental value is or what the square footage value is, even across market, and then just like extrapolating based on a bunch of stuff. Then they look at more mature markets too, and in places like Portland where ADUs have existed for several years, you're starting to see turnover that's more organic, less like quick development turnover, and that starts baking in the prices of the ADUs more realistically. But right now, you are gonna be selling that ADU and trying to convince the prospective buyer that it's worth what it's worth, because a home buyer looks at a house with an illegal garage conversion, and they look at a house with a perfectly legal garage ADU conversion. And if they're not planning on renting it, and sometimes even if they are planning on renting it, they don't appreciate the difference in liability that they're looking at between those two properties. So they're just like, oh, I got a bonus room in the garage, and like this is much better than a bonus room. It is an ADU. And what as markets like San Jose allow for separate conveyance, that will also accelerate how ADs get priced in. And in turn, how even a house without a unit, but with good potential, like a corner lot or good access, good space for a second unit, those lots will eventually go up in value too, because people will start pricing it in.
Right.
That's kind of a non-answer. Sorry. Does that make sense? You have a
No,
follow-up?
you're confirming everything that I'm already thinking. Yeah, for sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
And to go back to the manufactured housing question, that's even worse because like I see really horrendous. I see people who are not caught up to the times doing appraisals of manufactured ADUs, and you really have to protest and have the bank send out another appraiser because people will come out and say, "Oh, $0 value," and you really have to convince some appraisers that they should read a book. Anyway, so there's a bit of everything, even in developed market.
Could you put the appraiser's name and contact information in the chat?
I will try my best to remember it, and it's a really unique name. So once you type it in, I'm sure you'll find it.
Okay.
Well, and also
very-
we do a follow-up email after every call. So anybody who's registered for the call, we can recap and we can follow up with you, Ryan, and make sure we get
Yeah.
that to you. No
And
problem.
honestly, that's specific to Long Beach because I think
Yeah.
he's south of LA. But like honestly, the ADU Academy that I mentioned, there's a registry of all the specialists who complete that certification, and it's by region and has their trade, and there's a map. So like become part of the network if you're really into it, and
Yeah.
you'll benefit. It's a 1 day certification, but it's much deeper than like a 1 hour course. There's a big real estate section, a big finance. There used to be an appraisal section, now it's just finance. Um, then there's a building and an architecture design sections. So 4 big chunky sections. And then once you graduate, I just keep going back and we all hang out in the hallway and we started doing a lobby con with our own little agenda, which is you kind of keep up on the latest that way, talk about what's cutting edge.
So do you have to fly to Seattle to take that, or can you do it online?
Yeah, they have an online version and it's great. But yeah, there's an online version. It's a 3 hour, I think, and there's a test. You get the certification. What you're asking for, based on your comment, though, wait for it to come back. After Seattle, there's going to be one in San Diego or LA, and just do that one.
Okay.
It'll probably be in like February. Don't quote me on that.
Okay.
So Stephen, I noticed put something in the chat a little while ago, and the comment was to just think of it as additional space, like over a detached garage. And that really brought it into focus for me because we do have a lot of that here. And I wonder if it's labeled an ADU versus, just space on top of your garage, finished space. Do you have any sense of are the taxes affected differently, or how does it either help or hinder the homeowner as it relates to that?
Yeah. So, again, this goes back to the philosophical question, is ADU the right choice? Because if you can achieve your goal with extra space and you don't need to pull permits for like gas or electrical or sewer, then extra space is much cheaper to achieve and it will be appraised at a lower value. But prospective home buyers might still value it a lot. So like you might get everything you want. You put grandma on the garage, probably not the most accessible option, but whatever. And that you might achieve everything you want. If you do it as a full-fledged ADU in a market that understands ADUs, then it's a much more flexible, permanent housing option that has a lot more potential value, in my opinion. It also will likely get assessed differently for taxes. For all the tax and financial questions, obviously, I'm like, not financial advice.
Yeah, of course.
And for county tax assessors in California, we have Prop 13. So if you buy your house in 1970 for a bag of magic beans, you're paying like very little property tax still today. And that's still the case after you build the ADU. The county assessor will do an assessment of the new construction, and that will get added to your taxes at today's rate, but they are not supposed to touch the existing structures assessment. Even in a conversion, they're just assessing the conversion part. So you always want to call your county tax assessor and find out what their process is. But
Sure, that's
that is
pretty
state
significant, actually.
policy in a state like California. Oh yeah.
In New York as well.
There you go. We wouldn't get ADUs here in anything that was owned pre 1980 if it reset your taxes. And it was a big myth that NIMBYs promoted to say, oh, if you build an ADU, it'll reset your taxes. And it really hampered the movement until we could show legislation that says, no, it won't.
Okay.
Question. So, you've talked a lot about how they're really popular in places like Portland, Los Angeles, kind of like these cities that have a more residential feel, if you will. But how do ADUs perform in suburbs and rural areas?
Yeah. Great question. So, one of my favorite things about ADUs, as my little housing advocate kind of revolutionary hat, is that they go everywhere. When you give homeowners the ability to do this, they take advantage of it. Not 100%, but a gentle amount of your neighborhood will start adding units. And that even happens in highly exclusionary neighborhoods Like, if you want to look up Woodside, California, or Atherton, California, these are bastions of the tech billionaires that that have built beautiful communities and are highly protective of them. Sometimes get caught doing very funny things to try to block new housing, but you give them the ability to build ADUs, and all of a sudden everybody's a little developer. So I love ADUs because they end up everywhere. Now, having said that, in rural areas, so I live in Napa. If I go north in Napa County or north in Sonoma County, you're finding properties that are very large and have the size for development, but they're not. They're often on septic systems. They're often in fire-prone areas, and all of those are reasons that you might not be able to build or might not want to build. And either because fire-prone, the area might say, "Please don't build here," and the state gives regions the ability to say no in very high fire hazard severity zones. Or if you're on a septic system and you got to upgrade the septic for an ADU, like that's adding $70,000 to your project. You're like, "Ooh, I don't know. It sounds like I could get a very nice place in the city." And that's why ADUs tend to be more infill, what we call infill development. Suburbs, which you allude to, if you take Santa Rosa, which is a big-ish city in northern Sonoma, and it's got a bunch of suburb towns, which were heavily affected by the urban fire, unfortunately, in 2017. The rebuild in Santa Rosa, almost every single rebuild has an ADU. Because if you're going to rebuild today, well, you might as well put in a second unit instead of the garage. And so I shouldn't say every single, but like when I go there, it is hard to find a house that doesn't have two little mailboxes. And that's how it tends to fill in a market where, for unfortunate reasons, they had to do a lot of new construction all at once. And given the size of the lots, they were like, "Well, hold on, I can always put a second unit." It also leads to one of the we should probably talk about like the common use cases, but in Santa Rosa specifically, I keep running into people who have like a tenant who's never there. It's like, "Oh yeah, she's been dating somebody for 2 years. She still wants to have her own place, but doesn't need it to be a giant house, so she just like lives in the over the garage." Like that kind of mythical, wonderful tenant is something that the traveling nurse, everybody wants the tenant that doesn't exist, the tenant that's never there. But it is a house. It is a use case for housing that like we do have traveling nurses. We do have people who are in a relationship and not ready to lose their independence. We have people who are traveling the world half the year and just need a place to put their skis in the summer and their friends in the winter. And like right now, those people need to use a big old house and leave it vacant the whole year. And in a world with a few more tiny options, then you've got other use cases.
Yeah, I've got a friend living in an ADU in Vermont right now, and I think that they sort of rent it out seasonally, like maybe more medium-term rentals seasonally. So it's not necessarily a long-term, but that's pretty rural area, and it works for them there, and in fact covers their entire mortgage, the people who own that home.
Yeah, we like there's crazy use cases where like in Walnut Creek, somewhere in the East Bay South Bay area, there's somebody who does micro units. They're 300 square foot studios. He specializes in 3 month or shorter leases, and it's traveling professionals. They know what they're getting. They want a furnished tiny unit. They're paying more per square foot than equivalent rentals, but they're paying $400 less than the cheapest rental on market. So they're happy. He's getting like 3,000 a month on these 300 square foot units, so he's happy. And like he deals with the extra vacancy rate, like he's okay with it. And like that's a type of housing that hasn't existed for a really long time. And it's a lot more palatable to the NIMBYs who want to preserve neighborhood character. It's a lot more nicer to have a little micro studio with 3 month tenants than an SRO down the street from their single family home. A single resident occupancy, like one of the old school like pay by the night places. So
Brian,
lots of options.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
Across the country, we've seen more restrictions around Airbnb type of properties, short-term rental properties that, weren't there when people first bought those properties with that initial use in mind. What do you see for the future as it relates to, obviously you don't have a magic wand here, but
Crystal ball.
what are your thoughts around, that kind of thing? Do you think that'll, develop down the road, or do you see ADUs as being different because of the way they're being constructed and et cetera?
You hit on my trick answer at the end of your question, which is ADUs are just another type of housing. So almost anytime I have a very difficult question to answer, like one of these meaty philosophical questions about short-term rentals, I say, whatever you think about the main house, thinking about the ADU too. And whenever a politician proposes a rule that would restrict the ADU in some way, like, oh, it can't be 2 stories, I go, well, can the main house be 2 stories on that lot? If so, what's the difference here between the first house and the second house? Like, what philosophical reason do we have to think that like second
Yeah,
houses are different? And so, whatever you think about ADUs for the first house, we should do that for the second house as well, in my opinion.
great.
Um,
Well,
I think in the long run, the trend, it's just one of these funny things. Like California is another great example because it's always like 10 years into the future in the bad way and the good way. And like we allowed for short-term rentals, but a lot of hotels out of business. Now we're converting we didn't build any housing, so there was increased homelessness. And now we're converting hotels into transition housing for the homeless. And we're not allowing cities to build actual transition housing. And it's just kind of crazy. If we know what we need, we should just build each of those housing types. But instead, we're like chasing our own tail, kind of like replacing things and converting things instead of just doing the construction to begin with. And it's a hard market to predict because of that. That's what I'll say.
We have a question from Sandy in the chat. She said,
Yay.
you just mentioned that ADUs might need to pull permits to build them. Is that based on municipality or statewide?
Let me try to answer that. So yes, if you're doing construction of a permanent habitable unit, you're gonna need permits, and you're gonna want permits for liability reasons. The permits, you almost always seek them from a local agency, like a municipality. In some states, and I can share a list that they email out after the call, there are statewide rules that usually the state says, hey, all cities now have to allow this, and there's like this much wiggle room they have in what they can limit you to. And so you kind of have to learn the state rules, apply at the city level. And if the city says something that feels like it's outside those restrictions, then you go paddle to the state and kind of get it varies by state, but that's generally the gist. Then states either have like good, bad, or ugly policies. So if you're in a state with good policy, there is a way to paddle to the state. If you're in a state with bad policy, it usually says like all cities have to do this unless they don't want to, or or all cities have to do this, but we left some gray areas, and so cities can charge $20,000 impact fees, and like that kills your project, stuff like that. And in bad states, they implemented a law but included poison pills. So like there's a state, I forget which one, that you can build an ADU, but there's a deed restriction that says it has to be occupied by somebody, a blood relative of the owner of the property. And it's like, this is crazy. That's gonna go to the courts one day, because how are we legislating like you can only allow your blood relatives to live like oh, and they have to be seniors. It's like they're good, bad, ugly. All of it exists.
Thanks for that answer. I have a question. Something that's occurring to me as you've talked about this is, obviously this has a lot of potential to impact affordable housing for people in cities, suburbs, rural even. And you've experienced it in certain markets firsthand where it's already well underway. Like, how is it impacting communities? Because when I hear about it, I actually get excited, like about the idea of this being in a suburb, because I feel that it, like, suburbs in the suburbs, growing up in a suburb, like it can be separate, or, especially rural, like you're further and further from your neighbors. This kind of creates an opportunity to have a neighbor in your backyard and like kind of be in community in a way that maybe we haven't been in a long time. So I'm curious what you think about how it's affecting communities.
It's really cool. I've obviously seen examples on the extremes, and we could talk about ways to do it wrong and ways to do it wonderfully. But the vast majority fall on the wonderful side of the spectrum. These are smaller on average because of the limits on lot size and the limits in the lot, so they tend to be naturally affordable. Also, because it's usually a mon pa landlord that's like their first unit they're renting. If they rent, it's usually to a family member or a friend, and so it's even more affordable. Or if they rent to a stranger, they tend to really want to be selective about their tenant in ways that I'm sure are legal. But that means that they're willing to offer slightly below market to find the right tenant. And then they keep the tenant as long as they can, and the tenant likes being there. So you see a lot of really good scenarios. Very commonly, you're seeing people who get to stay in their neighborhood because they were able to put the money together for the ADU. I've met families that were going to have to leave the state, leave the country. I've seen people get to stay in multi-generation family situations thanks to being clever about financing the ADU before things got too extreme. And the more financing opportunities become available to low-income earners based on the future potential of the ADU, the more equity we'll find in these scenarios. There's, not to get too wonky, but like California did a $40,000 ADU grant, and the research is being done on research will be published soon about how equitable that grant actually was, and it's really cool. It shows that you give somebody a little bit of money to start the project, and it gets them over that hump and creates really amazing equity and affordability scenarios that create housing security for people who normally have a really hard time maintaining home ownership, demographically speaking.
Mm.
So it's super exciting.
Yeah.
And the other thing, like, just, it starts off, most markets start with affluent homeowners doing this first. And your client, you'll go to your book and you'll know who's got the properties for this already. And a lot of the time it's, I meet a lot of single widows who are living in a house where they raise their kids, and they don't have access to the whole house anymore. It's usually up in the like Berkeley Hills or whatever. And so they basically only use one floor of their 3-story house, one bedroom of the 4 bedrooms. And they don't know if they can keep living in California because healthcare costs are going up, blah, blah, blah. If they can build a universally designed, accessible ADU on grade in their backyard, it's their dream house, it's their forever house, rent out the primary, it pays for the construction, even at today's rates. That's a perfect scenario. And now they know they have a house for them. They've created a new rental opportunity. Sometimes they end up renting that to their own kids. And then they're involved in childcare, so the kids are happy. Like it's just wonderful all around, right? Like you get really cool outcomes when you start thinking more flexibly about what we can do. All of this stuff is like giving people choice, right? If you give people choice, they'll make good choices about their own property, and that's wonderful.
That's awesome. We've got some comments. Feel free to chime in and take your mic off to anyone if you want to. What were you going to say, Mom?
I was going to say, as we start to wind down a little bit, I do want to see if you could share some of the successes that you've had, where they were. Again, I'm still kind of not sure if this is something that can or can't be done in my state, but is there an area that you think is extreme, like is a place that does this really well outside of, you've already mentioned California, obviously.
Yeah, so it's here. Let me pull up the quick list of the states that have awesome rules. Arizona, California, Colorado, Montana, Oregon, and Washington have really good state laws. States like Hawaii have passed they're the math law, like great law, but allow cities to opt out. That's usually the first phase. 2 years later, they'll come back and pass a law that's like, okay, now you got to do it. New York tried really hard to pass a great law, and that was a couple years ago now. And I like that they chose to lose the fight completely rather than implement an ugly policy. But what that means is the cities now are coming up with policies, and eventually the state will come back and say, "Look, we did it in Albany or whatever, and like the sky didn't fall. Property values are going up." And so you'll see the reform leak in like that. And the way to figure it out is to just hit your local planning departments in the markets you operate in and say, hey, are there ways to do in-law suites, ADUs, tiny's? Like what new things are out there? They have brochures that they created for their market and or sorry, for their jurisdiction. And that's the best way to kind of keep up with things.
See, but
Does that
that's the
make
thing
sense?
that I'm confused about, because I think every city in New York that I'm aware, every town that I'm aware of does allow in-law suites. What you can actually do with
Yeah.
them is different. So I can have an in-law suite in my basement, or in my garage or wherever. But then there's rules around whether or not I can rent it.
Sure.
Um,
And I skipped an important part of the beginning too. The cool thing about these in the states that I'm mentioning is that they are by right. So it is not a conditional use permit. Because obviously you could go to any city and be like, I would like special permission, and then they'll come in and the planning commission says you got to do the windows this way and you got to do this, and the neighbors have a comment period. It is once the state passes a law or the city passes a law that does them either administratively or by right, that's when they really have superpowers, because that's when they go very, very fast. And that's what you're aiming for.
got it.
And so yeah.
One other question that's very specific to me right now, so I'm sorry if I take this astray, but I have a home that's I have a buyer buying a home in Dobbs Ferry in New York, and there's actually two homes on the property. And the second home is considerably smaller than the first home. So it almost sounds like exactly what you're talking about. But they're considered two single family homes. It's not an accessory at all. So is there a benefit to it actually? Like, would my client benefit in some way to try to get it classified as an ADU, or does it just make sense to let it be?
It depends what the client wants to do and what the current state is. So like if they want, let's hypothetically, they want to rent out each one separately and they're allowed to do that, don't poke the
Don't touch it.
hornets
Yeah,
usually,
okay.
right? Like, but if what they want to do is rent out both units and currently one is not on the books as a separate unit, like maybe it's often a small detail, but like the breaker box is inside the primary house and like you can't access it from the second unit. Some small detail like that
Got it.
prevents it from being a true independent habitation. Then it makes sense to find out what those small things are, fix it, and now you're cooking, right? Now you got two units,
Got it.
if that's what you want.
Makes sense.
We've got a
Yeah.
couple of people asking in the chat specifically about a California policy maybe that was drafted, AB 1033. Do you
Yeah.
think?
So that's the separate conveyance condoization we were talking about.
Oh, okay.
And sorry, what was the question? Sorry, I didn't mean that.
Do you think the city of LA will opt in? And if so, when? Yeah, that was pretty much the question.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for watching the show. So yeah, the 1033, will city of LA opt in? I don't know. I think San Jose already has. I bet you'll see Sacramento and San Diego do it. I I have hope that LA will do it, but I don't think that it's top priority. And so I wouldn't base your next 5-year strategy on the city of LA adopting it. But if you're thinking 10 years in the future, I would assume adoption in a lot of large metro areas in Napa. But that's just me. It's just I'm throwing darts at the board, right? So like don't go basing life investments off of that.
It's an
I
interesting.
think what happens exactly, and like here's the the behind the scenes, like the state kind of made it seem accidentally like cities couldn't allow the separate conveyance in the first time they passed the law. But the whole time, my argument is the cities were always able to allow for the separate conveyance, but they were timid because they don't want to get in trouble and they don't want litigation. So they say, hey, state, if you pass a law that says we can explicitly do it, then we'll start exploring. And so it's kind of that's why things have rolled out this way in my in my guess of an opinion. But it's working out.
There is it's a side note here. Santa Monica is in the process of opting in for what is it? AB 33.
1033. Nice. Guys, it's here's the we'll get to Kelly in a second too. But like the craziest thing about that law is it only had one entity opposed it in Sacramento, one lobbying group, the California Association of Realtors. And every time I tell a California realtor that, they're like, "I'm sorry, what?" and that is the nuttiest part. What? Because everybody likes this, who understands that these are listings. So we'll see how that develops in the near future. Kelly, what you got?
Oh, I just wanted to comment that, when you go to the title company and you ask them, hey, how do we do one of these transactions? Assuming that it gets passed, right, or that it gets adopted, they have no idea. Okay. I mean, and for us to have to create a condominium board and all of that stuff with it is a lot. And you can just imagine.
There's a group called the Casita Coalition, and I'm on the board. It's a lobbying group for missing middle housing and ADUs. And they are, if you have a city that wants to adopt the policy, they will help your city draft the ordinance. Once you have that policy in your city, there are attorneys who specialize in this. And I've met some of the people who want to specialize in it in California, but personally, I like speaking to the people who are actually practicing in other states. And you can hire both. You can hire either. But Julie Alexander in Austin has done like 2,000 of these mini HOAs, and so she can condominiumize a paper towel if you want her to. Like she knows how to do it, and then I would always rather go to somebody like that because they know that there's like 4 different ways to shape the HOA, and you want the one where nobody has meeting. There's everything is kind of like really explicit in a short 10-page document, and like you don't need to spend half your life in meetings and litigation and arbitration. It's like these are the rules, this is how it's set up, whether people own the walls or the thing. There's a few templates and she's got them, or whoever you decide to use. Find a lawyer who already does these. That's one part where actually, even if you do count on the locals, it's the county that does a lot of the plat mapping, not the municipality a lot of the time. So sometimes your best local contact is actually a really find an old person who's been surveying for a long time, and they'll like know everybody in the game, and then you go hire the attorney, and you kind of have the old surveyor like the old gold prospector. No, the old surveyor, and they'll know everybody at county, and then you get the lawyer to draft it up right. Does that make sense? People always try to hire me for that. I'm like, no way. I'm not touching it with a 10-foot pole. You need an old surveyor and a young lawyer.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Everything in New York has to do with attorneys. We have
Yeah, right. It's the way we built the system. Even in California, most of these housing projects before the buy right stuff, they would get blocked by environmental policy because we set up CEQA, the California Environmental Public Quality Act, to let any individual or entity do any project for any environmental impact. And that's why you always see news stories about like, oh, it cast shade on my zucchini garden, so I'm suing. And there was one in Berkeley last year for the noise of the students. at the dorms would be an environmental impact. So not having any parking would be an environmental impact because people crowd other parking spots. You see everything. Anyway, lots to talk about in the housing world.
Well, this has been very educational for me. Hope it has been for everybody else here. A very, very heartfelt thank you, Ryan, for
Oh,
joining us
pleasure,
and
my pleasure.
sharing. And for everybody else here. Cole, what do we have coming up next?
Next up, we've got, it's going to be on, give me a second to pull it up, and I'll actually just share my screen so you can see what our quarterly lineup is. Let's see. And just
Yeah,
so
we're
you
going
know,
into a new quarter, or we're in a new
oh,
quarter?
no, just sharing quarter 3. But just so you know, Ryan, I'll reach out to you after. I did save a couple of the links that you dropped in the chat, so I can make sure to send those out to attendees after. But if there's anything else you think I should include as a resource to everyone, I will.
Ah, it's
Sure.
Laura
And then
next.
broadly, ooh, nice. Broadly, guys, if you aren't sick of my dumb jokes, you're gonna love the YouTube channel. You're gonna love the TikTok, the Instagram. How to ADU. If you are sick of my dumb jokes, I appreciate your patience.
Well, for those of you that are going to go ahead and follow Ryan, we will shamelessly request that you take a look at our Every Move Collective YouTube channel. And we hope to be able to return the favor. If you liked what you heard here today, there is a great way to just write us a Google Business review. Colby will include that in the email. And actually, Laura, Coach Laura Treance is up on in 2 weeks from now. So we hope to see some of your faces there. Laura is an expert on disc. She has worked with Tony Robbins before in that capacity, and a personal friend of mine as well. So she's an excellent speaker, excellent trainer. I think you guys will enjoy her as well. So thank you for joining us. To be respectful of your time, we're trying to wrap on time.
Thank you, everyone. We'll reach out with an email, and thanks for being here. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Appreciate you
Bye,
guys.
everyone.
Bye-bye.